Excellent. I think we've got a good cohort of people who have joined in. So I'm going to get going and say welcome to this, what I understand is quite a rare ACEDS and EDRM collaboration presentation to share with our Australian New Zealand network the work that we've done on the duplicate identification project, that we are focusing on the use of what we've called message ID hash. And a really big thank you guys for signing up, joining in, and I will make a start on formally welcoming the panelists and welcoming you all. So traditionally, as we do for all of our ACEDS Australia New Zealand chapter events, I want to say hello, thank you for coming, but also importantly, in the spirit of reconciliation, I wanted to acknowledge that the ACEDS ANZ chapter board acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Also, I'd like to say kia ora to our New Zealand friends and followers who might be joining us today. Quick sound check. I think we've done this offline. We've got a chat function in the middle. If anyone's having any issues with sound, you've got the chat there. Let us know quickly. I think we've done this. Our running time today is 1 hour. It's currently shortly after 11 a.m. in Brisbane, where I am. We should be wrapping up slightly before midday. We have allowed time for some Q&A at the end with our participants, so please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Just a quick note on ACEDS. This is brought to you by the ACEDS Australia New Zealand chapter. As some of you may or may not know, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with ACEDS, but the Association of Certified E-Discovery Specialists have chapters globally, including across the US, the UK, but we in the last 12 months founded the Australia New Zealand chapter with my colleagues who you can see on the screen that form the board, and I wanted to formally thank them for their time supporting the ACEDS chapter and putting things like this together. And for those of you who are new to ACEDS, essentially our chapter goals are to create and welcome a community of professionals to a safe technology agnostic group that focuses on education, knowledge sharing and improving the state of e-discovery in our region specifically. So this is a really great session, I think, that both collaborates with the EDRM, but importantly, this project has been one that our group, and I'm sure Beth will explain it better than I do, have had a look at something that we do in the e-discovery industry every day and how to think about, well, how can we potentially do this better? So I think really great content for our ACEDS community. So thanks for joining us, everybody. More information on ACEDS, you've got our website there, but that's not the important part. What's important is who's joining me today. So hopefully you can see their faces on the screen now, but our esteemed panelists who've volunteered their time today, who are also members of the EDRM Duplicate Identification Committee. We've got Beth Patterson, who many of you know is an honorary Australian despite her US accent, and also despite the fact that she's joining us from her mother's house in the US, is the director of ESP Connect and an adjunct professor at UTS Sydney Law School. So thanks, Beth, for joining us. Craig Ball, who is joining us from New Orleans in USA. Hello, Craig.
G'day.
One of the most technically competent lawyers that I know, professor at the University of Texas Law School and passionate proponent of all things deduplication and e-discovery technology. We've also got my old friend Matthew Golab, who is the Director of Legal Informatics and R&D at Gilbert & Tobin here in Sydney, Australia, joining us to talk about his experience of working on the project and what he's done in the past. And my other friend and colleague, Gavin Wingfield, who has joined us also from Sydney. Are you in Sydney at the moment, Gavin? I believe you do travel a bit. Who is also the Director of Applied Legal Technology at King & Wood Mallesons. So really great to have such esteemed firms speaking and representing us today. And with that in mind,
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Emma, for that warm introduction. And for those of you who may not know, Emma and I go back a very long way. And it's been a real privilege to have you on our Dupe ID team, Emma. So thank you. So what do we want to do today? We want to talk to you about a new solution to duplicate identification for emails. And so I want to give you a bit of an intro to that. I'll pass it over to Craig to describe the problem and our solution. And then we're going to talk through some use cases, which is probably, in my mind, a really important part of this presentation, where you can take away some actual use cases that you might be able to identify within your own practice. Some considerations with every solution in e-discovery. There are always considerations, and like any good e-discovery tool, you need to know how to use it and where it will work and where it might not work. So we're going to take you through some of those. We've also developed a really extensive toolkit to help you understand what we've created and how to use it. So I'll talk you quickly through that. And then our timeline and our launch, which we actually did already pre-Legal Week in March. And then just want to end with what we need from you and some Q&A. So that's our plan of attack for today. But before we jump through the slides, I got ahead of myself. I'd just like to start out with explaining how we even started this project. And wind back to 2016, can you remember pre-pandemic? I hardly can. But I was at ILTA and Craig Ball was an esteemed panelist, and I happened to attend his session. And at the end, I raised my hand and said, do you think we could standardize the deduplication algorithm across products and platforms? Craig literally almost jumped off the stage. Craig, I'm glad you didn't. And said, yes, 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 what a great idea, I think so. And proceeded to write this amazing blog post that challenged our industry to solving this problem back in 2016. Unfortunately for Craig and for myself, no one took him up on it. And fast forward to 2021, April, yes, we were in the middle of the pandemic. And my friend Matthew Golab and I were on a federal court committee, Australian Federal Court Committee, reviewing technology. And Matthew said, Beth, you know that duplicate identification problem that you've been talking about for 9,000 years? Why don't you get EDRM, because you're on the advisory board, to actually do that? Why don't you run a project? Well, I took Matthew up on it. Thank you, Matthew, for that push, nudge. And fast forward 2 years later, and here we are. We have a solution. And I have to say, we started pretty broad. We identified we would love to come up with a standard deduplication algorithm for cross-platform deduplication, but we actually wound it back and decided to go for low-hanging fruit, and that was email duplicate identification. And it's really important to emphasize here that our solution can be used for identifying duplicates, and we'll talk about some use cases. It may be applied for deduplication as well. So we put together a fantastic team of about 25 colleagues across 7 continents. Here's the group. And I have to say, I was so impressed with their enthusiasm and their longevity. I didn't think we would stay motivated for 2 years, but literally, we were all so excited about solving this problem, because any of us that have practiced a lot know what a waste of time and money it is when we receive data from another party and have to reprocess it to get the same MD5 hash that the system that we've used has. So we decided to have people from a range of different organizations, law firms, service providers, consultants, product vendors. I'm pleased to say we had 4 product vendors on the team, representatives from Relativity, Reveal, Nuix, and EDT. And we set out to solve this problem. Just a couple quick points I'd like to make. One is we purposely described our solution as a specification, not a standard. This is a very useful cartoon about standards. You know, you want to come up with one and you end up with 15 competing standards. We didn't want to do that. What we wanted to do was create a specification that the industry would find so compelling and so practical that everybody would adopt it. So right now we're at adoption stage and we're encouraging everyone to adopt our solution. One other quick point, and that is we did a lot of testing. We used the Jeb Bush data as well as the John Podesta public email data sets, did extensive testing, and then we had lots of members, including everyone on this panel, who had lots of client data that we were able to push through our algorithm, and that's how we came up with our solution. So with that, I will now hand it over to Craig to jump into the actual problem and the solution we came up with. Over to you, Craig.
I understand. I'm just waiting to get the slides handed over. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from, I'm speaking on behalf of the Who Dat Nation here in New Orleans, Louisiana, as we have wrapped up the last 2 weeks of Jazz Fest. So it's rather late here, so if I doze off in the midst of this, please forgive me. Beth is, as always, too modest. The reason that we were able to have such a terrific, large team of very engaged and very knowledgeable people was largely attributable to her ability to lead us through this. This may be, for some of you, the problem that you never knew you had, but in fact, it is a very genuine challenge. And I am trying to advance slides.
Sorry, Craig, you can't do it?
Let me try again. I've pushed the button several times now.
I'm going to stop slide control, and then I'm going to re-give you control to see if that bumps it along. Would you like to try now?
Let's try that again. I'm sorry, Emma. I'm going to try it one more time. 3 times the charm, perhaps.
We did practice this extensively.
We did. There we go. Hello. So before I get into this, I'm actually going to move back one because it was so easy to move to that one, and say this. You know, when we think about the schematic that depicts the whole idea of what is electronic discovery and disclosure, we hope you think of the electronic discovery reference model, the EDRM. And although the EDRM is going through a reinvention in terms of that schematic at the moment, I've always thought that there's another EDRM after the EDRM we all know and love. And we see the process go to production. But for all of us who've been on the side of the requesting party, there's an entirely fresh and new, and it's in its own way quite challenging process that follows having the motley information that we receive in discovery dumped upon us. We have our own data that is probably in its native formats. We have productions that may show up in PDF with load files. We may have some in static TIFF images. And in the United States, the hardship and the curse of TIFF is still very much a part of this practice. And so what Beth mentioned, the idea of having to reprocess, is really only possible when you have the native information. Because when we consider how we go about deduplicating information, we need to lay a little foundation, and that is to talk a little bit about the digital fingerprinting that is cryptographic hashing using, say, MD5 or SHA-1 or any of the other popularly available hashes. And in that process, we are well familiar that you could take a single file, you can subject it to this free open source hash algorithm. You'll generate a 32-character hexadecimal value called a hash value for MD5. You could take an entire collection of files and folders, do the same thing, obtain that fingerprint, and finally, as I do as a forensic examiner on an almost daily basis, you can hash the entire contents of a piece of storage media and even calculate a hash that serves as a digital fingerprint for the precise contents of each of those items. And it's a proven, highly trusted, essential technology for electronic discovery. And when it comes to deduplication of loose files, it's served us well for many years. As we receive or process individual files, we will be hashing them, adding a hash value to a database, and then every subsequent file that's encountered or processed is likewise hashed. And even if they have different file names and different system metadata values, that is information of a metadata nature that resides outside of the file itself, again, system metadata, not application metadata, we can hash those items from different sources, different names, different system metadata, and still successfully identify those perfectly identifiable, those perfectly identical iterations that we can then suppress as needed in order to keep our focus on only a single instance of each item for purposes of review and characterization as responsive or privileged or otherwise. And of course, we are able to gain huge savings of time and money by applying this form of duplicate identification in the day-to-day e-discovery process. But historically, when it came to email, we had a different challenge. And my favorite movie is The Godfather. And so I've always loved talking about this in the contents of the dawn of the Corleone crime family, Don Vito. And we imagine Don Vito sitting in his garden one day late in life, and he sends an email to the members of the Corleone family. Luca Brasi before he sleeps with the fishes, Tom Hagen as consigliere, his lovely daughter Connie, his hot-headed son Santino, who should stay away from Tolbus, his son Michael, who could have been Governor Corleone, and his idiot boy son Fredo, who you should never go fishing with. And at any rate, he would send them all an email sharing a little wit and wisdom he's gained over the years. And of course, a neophyte to e-discovery would think, okay, I've learned about hash deduplication. I'm going to take all those emails, I'm going to hash them. And you'd find that not a single one of those between Vito and all the recipients would have a matching hash value, because necessarily, in order to reach different addressees, there has to be different information in the so-called header data associated with an email. And so we want to then approach duplicate identification with email by excluding those parts of an email that are inherently different. And so we don't want, say, the receive times, we don't want the path through the servers that might be used to reach the addressee, because that will necessarily be always unique. Instead, we approach it in a granular fashion, and each vendor does this in their own unique way by taking a selection of individual components of the emails, say the date, and we might hash the date and obtain an MD5 value for that field of information. The from data would be normalized and hashed. We would then have the addressees would be normalized, ordered, and hashed. And as we would go through this process, applying it to the subject and to the CC addressees and to others, we would begin calculating a table of MD5 values that collectively tend to serve as a proxy for the unique components of each individual email. And of course, as we go through the email, we want to hash the message body and have a value representing the two different versions of a message body that exist in each email, the unenhanced plain text version and the more enhanced HTML version. And so we'll hash the message body through our handy dandy MD5 hash algorithm, obtain that hash value. And finally, if we consider the last pieces of an email, we have Don Vito, a good company man. Whenever he sends an email, he always makes sure to have his olive oil company's logo included, the old Genco can there. And so now we have the attachment hashed. And collectively, once we've gone through this entire process, we will have a tablet of values that represent the individual shared components of this email, and excluding those items that will necessarily be unique and not helpful in finding an MD5 match. This process, because it's fairly complicated, because it requires a certain normalization and ordering, the next step is to take these values, and again, each vendor does it in a different way, and concatenate the hashes, essentially lay them end to end in a particularized order, and then hash that concatenated string once more. And once we've done all of that process, done in the unique way by each individual vendor, the vendors internally generate a hash value that they use to determine if an email message is or is not deemed a duplicate. But the problem with this is, as you can see, it's fairly complicated, and each vendor does it differently. So even if the vendors were to share this information, it wouldn't help. And trivial variations, even the most minute variations, an extra space, a different ordering, a different handling of the aliases that are put into the email clients in different iterations, will serve to make this process fail. So you need the native data to do it, and then moving forward from that is quite challenging. So you really couldn't, we found, come up with a standardized method to dedupe from a mixed grouping, some images, some native, some load files. It simply hasn't ever been feasible in a meaningful way, even, as I said, if the vendors had chosen to share their deduplication hashes, because if you use the hash mechanism used by EDT and tried to compare it to the hash mechanism used by Relativity or by another vendor or hosted provider, you would find that those mechanisms would not provide that comparison you need. And so under Beth's able leadership and joined by the really able group of people that worked so hard on this, we started down the road of let's find one way that everybody could do it, and quickly realized that not only was that going to be incredibly challenging to do, but it would require vendors who have established processes to reinvent how they do their work. And that we thought was problematic. But we wondered, what if there were a way that vendors could each furnish a simple durable identifier that would be tool agnostic, that would be separate from what the vendors did internally, but would serve as a unifying duplicate message identification value that would serve to function across native and static image productions, and essentially any form in which the messages might be provided, where the parties may negotiate on a common form of production. But irrespective of those changes wrought in the produced data, would still provide that common pivot point across a hash value. And that's where we've worked to bring forward the so-called EDRM message identification hash, or the EDRM MIH. And this is, in fact, that simple durable identifier that I mentioned to you. And you will find, as you look at how we do it, that it is incredibly simple, almost deceptively simple. How can you trust it? It's so simple when you see how the vendors historically have done it in such a challenging and convoluted way. It's very lightweight, it's cross-platform, and it isn't owned by anyone so that anyone can feel free, conforming with the guidelines put forward, to be able to have this work without having to license something or sell their soul to anyone. So here's how it works. Again, so simple, your first impression may be, can that possibly work? If we go back to the various emails from Don Vito, within every one of those emails, going back a very long time, there will be a value called the message ID. This is a highly unique value. According to the standards of the email authorities, the so-called requests for comments that over many, many years have led to the mechanisms of which all peoples around the world must adhere to in order for emails to be able to traverse the modern internet, we still have a mechanism whereby you can grab that one single field, the message ID. You don't have to do a lot of normalization or massaging of the data. It's a very lightweight, easy to harvest value that every vendor has at the ready. And you simply hash that for various reasons we are happy to talk about later, in terms of providing a level of consistency, a level of anonymity and of confidentiality in terms of the contents of the message ID, like a domain name. And this message ID has been around a very long time. It's been around since 1982, which means, without naming names, that it is actually almost been around as long as some of the people leading this call, if my memory serves, although everyone else on the call, every woman on the call is what, a scant 29, and I may be insulting them by putting them at that advanced age. So the message ID has been around a long time. It's very much a proven thing. And all we ask to do is that the vendors take this readily accessible value, that they MD5 hash it, and that it be produced along with the other standard values we see in load files. We hope that you, as parties to litigation and investigations, will make it a part of your routine practices to add the EDRM MIH as one of the standard fields of metadata that you would request, with the same regularity as you might request the name of the file or its hash value, or say its custodian name, location, path, etc. Very standard stuff that routinely is made a part of load files. And again, this would be furnished totally independently of whatever forms of production might be chosen, because you can do that, whether it becomes a TIFF or a PDF or something else. The value will still be applied because it is upstream of that gelling into a static form. It will then work cross-platform. So whether you're using one vendor or another, whether it's an old production that you have the MIH, or a brand new production, whether you have data that you've had for a while and you get something new on the eve of trial, this will enable you to quickly determine, what do I already have? Is this something I've seen before? And get right to the nubbin of what you need to see very quickly. And again, importantly, we respect the vendors have developed their own proven processes, and it would be presumptuous of us to say, do it our way. Instead, this is something that they can keep doing things the way that they're satisfied with, so they can hit the ground running, immediately add an EDRM MIH as a load file item without having to dramatically reinvent or recode their platforms. This can be done as a very simple script or in a variety of other ways, so that the major vendors can implement this, and many have implemented it already. Again, purely programmatic, essentially no cost at all. It's a machine thing, and it will lead to surprisingly robust savings of both time and, importantly, money. And so I'm going to stop there. I hope I've done it justice in explaining how it works and why it works, and we'll be very happy to talk with you about the extensive ways in which we've identified very minor considerations that you want to be sure that you look at as part of your implementation, so you understand its strengths and its very modest weaknesses. And I'll leave it there. And I thank you all for listening. I'll be here to answer questions and jump in as the desire might arise.
Craig, thank you so much for that amazing laying the foundation, as they say, to understand the problem we were trying to solve and the solution we came up with. I have to say, I might win a Trivial Pursuit question of how is the mafia related to e-discovery? I now know. So thank you for that clarification as well. I'm sure they get in trouble with their emails, just like all of us, right?
Let's not name any names of any of the companies that are controlled by the mafia. These are just legitimate business people here.
That's it. That's it. But great explanation of what we've done. We'd now like to turn to how do you use it? So as Craig pointed out, we believe this will save our industry and our clients significant time and money. And so we'd like to now turn to some use cases. And I'd like to just kick it off with Matthew. So Matthew, Gavin, and Emma are going to lead us through use cases. Over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, everyone. Just coming from Darrow, just to do my own little bit on Welcome to Country. This is enormously valuable as a mechanism for large-scale collections for large-scale corporates. Like, say, for example, financial institutions. Most regulatory or litigation involving a financial institution is a fairly large undertaking. And I'm just picking these as an example. This isn't exclusively limited to financial institutions, but typically they're very complex systems. If you have hundreds of thousands of employees, it's common that in any regulatory or litigation, the scope of that discovery is going to span many years, many people, and many systems that were in use during those years. And so we find simply that if say the client has used a email archiving system, or they have transitioned between on-prem to cloud-based email, that for many years we've noticed you can have to a human completely identical emails, but there is, as Craig articulated, there is sometimes very subtle metadata that isn't necessarily able to be distinguished by a human, although the lawyers will always say they're perfect and they can spot everything and they know, but I digress. I won't critique lawyers. You can use these mechanisms as a fantastic way to identify candidates that are duplicates, and we'll come through in the next phase why I say candidates as opposed to actually just knocking them out as duplicates. But we've had enormous savings in, if it costs $10, $5, $20, whatever to review a document, and if you can knock out 10%, 20%, 5%, 50, whatever percent of the corpus, and if you can knock that out early on, that's enormous savings throughout the whole process of, if you have a dispute that's before the courts and it runs for years, it's an enormous saving over time. The compounding of you have reduced the set of documents. My final point would be that, I'm speaking from a law firm perspective. You've also got, when you get to the courts and you're compiling the key bundle of documents, the court book, that typically that bundle of documents has, say, matured somewhat from the pristine collection from the discovery. And so using this metadata is an excellent way, the MIH, an excellent way to identify without any doubt between the parties, we have an identical copy of the document. So that's completely independent of the MD5 hash or whatever, however you got to the point of you want to use your version of the document versus someone else's version. Over to you, Gavin.
Thanks, Matt. Hopefully everybody can hear me this time around. Emma's nodding, which is always good. Thank you, Emma. Thank you all the other panel members as well. The interesting thing that I find with this, and Matt's touched on it as well, is that for about the last 15 years or more, I've actually been running custom deduplication of email sets which we receive. And the things that often affect the emails, where the lawyers will come to me and say, we've got 5 copies of this email. They're identical. They're not quite identical from the hashing perspective that Craig very eloquently demonstrated to us. The things that affect it, the viewing platforms, treating email attachments and embedded files differently, so stripping them out and moving them around. Added disclaimers, so if it goes externally, the added disclaimers, and also rounding issues of time that different systems will actually round up a second and to the next second, and that others will round down, which can actually cause all these issues. So I write these sort of really complex systems to actually do the deduplication for about the last 15 years, and I'm sort of kicking myself now to think I could have just used the message ID to do this exercise. I've actually applied it. On a few cases, we removed about 5% as potential duplicates. Well, that's going back to data from years ago. What actually interests me now with this and was really exciting is that so many of our organizations are now adding in a little header at the top when you receive an email that says external, or somebody else will receive an email that says this email has been received from an external party. So if you imagine an email that's circulated between 10 different parties, you collect all 10 of those, and they all add this disclaimer at the top, that's 11 copies of the same email effectively. Now, there are things which we'll touch on shortly, which do affect these things, where you would want to know that there's slightly different copies, BCC, for example, which as I say, we'll touch on. But for me, it's a method as well of identifying those similar files and duplicates that that somebody may have received this email slightly later than it was sent. There may have been delay in receiving it, and also that somebody was blind copied in. So just not using it to deduplicate, but also to identify effective duplicates of these. So, like I say, the occasions I've used, I've got about 5% duplication. I actually identify them. I actually load all of them into my database, and I actually just hide the ones from the assignments I allocate for review. And if I find there's a hot document, what I'll do is I'll say to them, the legal teams, they're all sort of trained on this. I'll say, if you find a document that's critical, that you want to find all other copies of this email that may have been received at a slightly different time, delayed or whatever, then there's actually a list that I provide, which in the database where they can just click through, load them up, and that's how it works. So that's the way we're applying it. So it's probably enough for me.
And I don't want to say too much because I think that's a perfect articulation of some practical use cases. I suppose I will just advocate for the opposite of what Matt said in terms of large commercial corporate litigation with big financial institutions. In a similar vein, we have a lot of clients, and I work on a lot of cases in the group litigation or the class action space, whereby the law firm that we're working with will be receiving incoming productions or disclosure from numerous parties. It could be tens of organizations, it could be hundreds of individuals. Every matter is slightly different. However, I think one of the powerful tools, especially in Australia, where those incoming productions are more often than not a load file with a PDF, because I'm receiving PDFs, there is no way currently to easily and effectively say, well, of all of these PDFs, are each of the 10 parties giving me one copy of the same email? Have I seen that email? Is that email in my production set or in my possession or my client's possession? So potentially, even for the smaller parties who, in the early stages of review, potentially don't have a huge volume of data, that volume comes to them from the large corporations like Matt, or the multiple parties or the multiple defendants to a claim that's being brought when they're potentially exchanging a copy of the same document. That's a great cost saving. The other thing I will say is in the UK, where I spent a good decade of my career, the standard for exchange and production of documents is in native form. So I sort of came from a very cushy and comfortable world where I could run those native MSG emails through an email threading tool or an analytics tool and identify email duplicate spares pretty easily. So yes, I had to do post-processing steps. And yes, technically I could have processed those native emails and extracted a message ID. I've also, similar to Gavin, spent a lot of time building custom deduplication tools. But, you know, it is interesting being back in Australia for the last few years that only receiving flat file PDF documents with an agreed load file, there's just no way to compare an email that's been turned into a PDF with your PDF email, I suppose. So yeah, lots of use cases, Beth.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin, Matthew, and Emma. Great. Just a couple more to add to that. When we presented this to the EDRM Advisory Council, we had have a senior partner who immediately said, I wish I'd had this today. I had a case and we had to get all this data reprocessed that we received from the other party because they'd processed their data in one platform and we'd processed ours in another. He said, we would have saved $100,000 today. And then later he revised that to $400,000 in a subsequent meeting. But we do believe there'll be significant savings. Another couple use cases some of our other team members have identified. One is just cross-border, when you need to exchange data and there may be privacy concerns, you can just exchange the MIH without the data and get a result cross-platform and identify duplicates. It's a compelling use case, I think. And we also have a team member, Ian Folkman, and he's based in Japan and Tokyo. And he identified early on that the MIH will help with some of the language translation issues and some of the actual filters that are used on Japanese, different character sets with Japanese, where this duplicates would not be identified, but with the MIH, because it's independent of the text in the email, duplicates would get identified. So those are a few more use cases to throw in. Craig, did you have anything to add to any of that before we jump on to consideration?
No, I put a thank you. I put a note in the comments, the chat, for those who might be thinking, but we already do duplicate. Why does this matter to me? I'm hoping I was able to address it, but thank you.
Super.
And
Okay.
I'll admit my naivety, Craig, that maybe I did appreciate, but maybe I didn't appreciate the extent to which each software vendor or platform calculated a different MD5 hash. Essentially, not all MD5 hashes are created equal, even though that is the intention.
It's a really,
let's be clear. Everyone provides an MD5 hash. So you're getting an MD5 hash for the loose documents, say attachments. Those hashes are very likely to match up to identify duplicates. But if you're going to get a production of email hashes from one vendor and a production of email hashes for identical emails from a different vendor, there's very little likelihood, if almost no likelihood, that those will match up, except the MIH will match up.
and Emma, back to your point, it's a great point, which I think a lot of people don't know how MD5s are really calculated for emails. And in our exchange protocols in Australia, we exchange MD5. But nobody says actually they're going to be different if you process in different platforms for emails. We kind of use the same label, but it's actually different. You get different values. Okay.
There's a conflation, Beth, that the MD5 is an algorithm, and that's a very established, very well-known algorithm used in a variety of different ways. And we all, you know, as a synonym, use MD5 to mean deduplicate.
Yes.
And so we've all blended that, well, it's using MD5. So of course it's you know, so we're not, I guess I'm starting to throw shade at MD5. I don't mean to, but let's move on.
I get your point, Matthew, and thank you. Okay. We'd like to just
we love you, MD5. We love you.
It works as long as you process on the same platform. We'd like to now jump to some considerations. So in our testing, and as I explained earlier, we did extensive testing. We identified some areas where our MIH won't perform perhaps like you think it might, and you may need to combine it with some other fields. And Matthew, I'd like to throw it to you to jump through some of the key
Sure.
considerations.
Sure. I guess the key is, so if an item is a synthetic or fabricated PST or MSG, as in some, like say Reuters and Bloomberg can output messages as in a PST container, they don't have message IDs. So simply, if an item does not have, if it is an MSG or an EML or whatever format of email and it does not have a message ID, then this process will not identify it. And you have the sheer unadulterated pleasure of reviewing that. And this is certainly an identification process. Time anomalies, as Gavin mentioned, there can be sometimes very subtle offsets of microseconds, second, up to minutes, where it's just, and we don't know why, but this helps you in identifying the, good thing I know what we're talking about, but
One moment.
the next one is attachments. So if you, like for example, some corporations, there are ways that you send something and your system, your corporate system may automatically identify you having a large attachment, detach the large attachment, and the recipients receive your email body and a message to be able to download with a link, but they don't receive the actual attachment. Gavin feels strongly about BCC, so I don't want to steal Gavin's thunder on that one. System generated and spam and fraudulent. So we noticed throughout our testing that it's actually a really great way. Sometimes with, say, there's an automatic alert in a client system that is just generating telemetry saying, I have updated a job or, you know, whatever. They may all have the same message ID. So it's a really great way if your matter doesn't, you know, if they are out of scope. It's a really excellent way of easily identifying, I don't need to look at these. I've probably spoken enough, so I know Gavin really wants to talk about BCC, so I won't steal his thunder anymore.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, the BCC is an interesting one. So when I run my process, I actually always preserve any email that's got a BCC and make that the primary message. Obviously, you want to know that the copy is being BCC'd. If you don't have that BCC copy, it's another one of those considerations where you look at an email and you say, is this an important email? Is this a hot email? Do we have other copies of it which have been received by other recipients that may have been BCC'd, where we don't have the BCC sent item, if you like? So that's certainly in there. Going back to the system-generated emails as well, that Matt was touching on as well, I identified in one of my cases it was actually an HR system that generated a reminder email to the managers. They need to do things, and around this sort of time, obviously in Australia, we're approaching performance review times, and you get all these little reminders that come out. The message ID is actually generated by the system for those. So each of the reminders for that recipient have the same message ID, which was really, really interesting to see. The ones for different recipients had a different message ID, but the ones saying you've got 30 days to complete, so you've got 10 days to complete this, 5 days, 4 days, so on and so forth. You're now 5 days overdue. Those all had the same message ID, and they were generated by the system. So it's provided a message ID within that. So that's definitely very interesting. The other thing, of course, to be aware of, and we don't touch on it too much, is that people can edit emails as well. So just be considerate of that. Do you want to touch on any other ones, Emma or Matt, that we've got in there?
Beth, do you keep cancelling my screen share?
No, I actually am not touching it.
Okay, well, I'm going to try to go back on a slide then. Yeah. We'll go backwards. Yeah, so the thing that I'm passionate about is, we've already explained it, is managing a large review team, and that, you know, you've used MD5 hash or SHA-256, but MD5 hash to deduplicate your emails, and you're serving out the lawyers one copy of every email, and they still say to you, but I've seen this email before. You know, and we've always been able to explain the technical reasons that the MD5 was different across emails, even though to the human eye, the two emails were the same. That is definitely that use case. But just if everyone thinks to, the current state of their email systems with security and risk, I know that, for example, at Sky Discovery, we've changed our system so that our signatures are appended at server side. So every email that I send to, say, Matt and Beth, the version that is saved in my sent items does not have my signature. And every email that Beth and Matt have from me has a big Sky Discovery signature block with information. I think for almost every case that I've worked on, a lawyer that I'm working with wants to only see one version of that email. Maybe they want to see the one with the signature, but they just don't want to, even though those two emails will have a different MD5 hash, they just don't want to see both, because it's not the signature that's driving the relevance or interest in that document. It's the body text. It's the substance of the email, not that signature. But you do need to be aware that technically those emails are different, because that signature is appended at server side, but they will have the same message ID hash. Similarly, as Gavin already mentioned, the tagging of external or confidential. I know there's a lot of government organizations that by default include external square brackets in the signature of an email. So when they reply to your email, you've seen that they've the system's updated. So my sent item won't have their inbox item. So because of the way that systems are working these days, just a lot of these anomalies are being caused by everyday security and email management practices. So that's my observation, I suppose.
Great. Thanks everybody for covering those. I'd like to jump through. I'm just conscious of time. The materials that we've created for you to better understand and apply the EDRM MIH in your practice. So the first document is the specification, and it's a succinct technical specification intended really to be used by the product providers who will be implementing the MIH. The second document, which I think I encourage everybody to read, is our guidelines document. And the intent of that document was to explain what we've done and why we've done it. You'll find methodology and use cases. You'll also find extensive explanation of the considerations that we just spoke about. And again, like any good e-discovery tool, you need to know your data set and what you're trying to achieve. I think our slides have gone rogue again, but I have no idea why. But the guidelines, I really encourage you to read. And with these considerations, you may need to use other fields in addition to the MIH to get the results that you need. The third tool that we have is an infographic. If you're just trying to convince lawyers or your client that this is a good idea, it's a one-pager that explains the problem and what the solution is. And finally, a white paper that Craig has written that is really a practical, non-technical intro to the use of the EDRM MIH, and really good tool to give to lawyers, intended audience there for lawyers. The second thing we did was develop some tools for you to help you. So the first big question is this MIH going to be in the product platforms that you may use? And the answer is yes, but they're not there yet. The 4 providers that I mentioned early on that were in our project team, Relativity, Reveal, EDT, and Nuix, have all committed to putting it in their products. What we're going to do is put a link on the EDRM website to the materials once they've implemented it in their product. Also recently, actually, I think today, Law and Order has confirmed that they will be writing a tool for Relativity that will be a Relativity app published as a Relativity app. So anybody who's a Relativity user, that will become available. And again, we'll be putting links on the EDRM website. In addition, already on the EDRM website, we've built a little Excel spreadsheet that will convert message IDs to an EDRM message ID hash. And you can do groups, so you can copy your data in, create the MIHs, and then copy the data out. We also have instructions on how to use Notepad++, which I think Matthew identified, will create an MIH, a message ID hash, and there are instructions on how to do that on the EDRM website. We've also created a test data set if there are any product providers attending. This is a test data set that you can use if you've implemented the MIH to make sure it's calculating the MIH correctly. And finally, we're going to be creating an app that will read common email data files and extract the message IDs and calculate MIHs as output. That's not available yet, but will be coming. In terms of our timeline, oh, I've jumped slides. Hold on a sec. In terms of our timeline, we launched this the week before Legal Week, which was mid-March. And we're obviously in the process of working with the product platforms to implement a calculation of the MIH. And we're out basically spruiking our solution to people like yourselves. And we really want to encourage you to start asking for the MIH in protocols. So if you are a product vendor, we want you to implement this. If you are a service provider or a law firm, we'd like for you to put it in the protocols and start to use it. I think you heard from our panelists, Gavin, Matthew, and Emma, some really practical ways and things you can do with it today that will save your client time and money. And if you're a regulator on the call, we really, really want you to put it into your standard protocols, and we'll probably be tapping you on the shoulder individually at some point in the future. So spread the word. We're really excited. We think, again, it will save our clients time and money and be a really practical way to basically identify duplicates for cross-platform emails. With that, Emma, I'll hand it back to you for Q&A.
Thanks, Beth. Excellent. And I have seen a bit of chat go by. I don't have any particular questions, but we do have a little bit of time for some of the panelists to stick around. Does anyone have a specific question that they would like to raise to the panel? Now's your time. I think you'll have to put it in the chat box or the Q&A box.
Just like to amplify what Beth has said. I put it in the chat already, but even if you don't immediately recognize how this will have value today for your clients, it will gain value. And because it is trivial to ask for it, make it a routine part of your standard requests. Once it is something you have in your quiver, you will find many ways in which it will be there. And its value only increases over time, because as you have an older collection where you have the MIH value to draw on, you can then determine that it's new material, old material. You can redeploy characterizations of privileged items. You'll find creative ways to save money and benefit your clients. But the only way that's going to happen is by starting now to collect the MIH as part of the data that you receive and demand.
Great. Well said, Craig.
Emma, one of the common questions we get asked is why do we decide to hash the message ID? Because the message ID is a unique. And I'm going to ask Matthew or Craig to maybe answer that for the audience.
So the message ID, you can use the message ID as is, you don't have to hash it. But if you're exchanging it, the message ID can be reverse engineered. Craig will be able to be a lot more articulate on this than I, but there is metadata in the message ID, such as the email domain, and I think a date timestamp. And if you have something that's highly sensitive and you have redacted extensively, I know sometimes that happens, and it's a joyous thing, very satisfying seeing redaction, particularly when someone else did it and you didn't do it, but I digress. You may have redacted the sender and the sender domain, or you may have redacted the timestamp. You may not be providing that. So we wanted to make sure that it is safe, just like exchanging the MD5. It's simply a alphanumeric string that you're exchanging.
Great.
Beth, it affected to summarize Matt's points, which he made very well. It's effectively to make it that there is no obstacle on resistance to exchanging this information. There's nothing in it which can be of use to people. So there's no reason not to exchange the EDRM MIH.
And also just to reiterate, many systems in use have amazing capabilities. We're simply offering this as anyone can do this. There's a DIY. Obviously, you can't manually do this yourselves with our tools for large-scale volumes, but you don't have to be using somewhat expensive, incredibly sophisticated e-discovery systems in order to use this to your benefit.
Every e-discovery vendor has the capability to calculate an MD5. It is the most trivial and common feature of all of these tools. And anyone who harvests email data has access to this message ID. We've taken two incredibly standard things, fused them together to create something that is much stronger than either of them alone, that will allay your concerns about security, that is lightweight, essentially no cost, and over time will only grow in value to you. So think of yourself as being the people who bought Bitcoin 15 years ago. If I need to put it on that kind of ridiculous basis and say, this is your big chance.
Fantastic.
Love it.
Fantastic. One other thing I'd just like to say is put in a big plug for our Australians in the audience and on our project team. Our project team, we had a large contingent of Australians. I personally haven't dual citizenship, but would really like to see Australia lead the world in our implementation, although I'm plugging for the US as well, I have to say, and worldwide. But I do think we have a very collaborative ethos in the Australian and New Zealand market that perhaps will allow us to jump on this perhaps quicker than our colleagues from around the world. But of course, we want everybody to use it. We often get involved in the cross-border cases, through Asia, through US, etc. So I think we've got a real opportunity.
Well, thanks, guys. Thanks very much to our panelists. Matthew, I think you have to run. We've got some enthusiastic, feedback coming in. Will, yeah, absolutely. Why can't we just get that Genco data set, Craig, and ditch the Enron data? Wouldn't that be juicy? Let's see what that can do. I'm not going to pretend.
We'll make them an offer they can't refuse.
It keeps coming. It keeps coming. Thanks, guys, for joining in. We've got Enron, the data set we love to have. Lots of enthusiasm coming through. Lots of people saying they're looking forward to seeing this regularly used. I think we've got some review managers I know on the call who've probably had the heartache of having to review the same duplicate documents over and over and over again, having a look at some of that. So thanks again. Beth, thank you so much for your hard work putting together this working group. Craig, for your technical expertise and your entertaining presentation that I have seen before but would see again. And to Gavin and Matt for sharing your insights. And I know that you've used this before. So, thanks again for your time. And thanks everyone for coming along and hearing all about it. I look forward to seeing what happens next.
Super. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, guys. I'm going to end now.